3 weeks ago, he watched his closest friend and mentor die in front of him. This week, he found out he's fighting for his own life. And instead of going silent, he sat down and wrote the most powerful statement you'll hear in racing this year. This is the story of Rick Houston, and it's not over yet. Rick Houston, veteran NASCAR journalist, historian, and co-host of the Scene Vault podcast, has revealed he's been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that has already spread to his liver. He broke the news himself on the same platform he's used for years to preserve NASCAR history, X, through the Scene Vault podcast account. No pain right now, according to Houston. His biggest concern isn't himself, it's his family and what they're about to carry with him. And here's the part that's stopping people in their tracks. He's not stepping away from the podcast. He says he's not going anywhere. To understand why this story is landing so hard in the NASCAR world, you need to rewind to June. Just weeks before this diagnosis, Houston lost his podcast co-founder and longtime mentor, Steve Waid, at 77 years old. Waid wasn't just a colleague, he gave Houston his start in this industry decades ago, eventually becoming one of his closest friends. Houston was in the room when Waid passed, and in a moment that NASCAR media insiders still haven't stopped talking about, he leaned in and reminded Waid how far they'd come since 1990, the year Waid initially turned him away and wouldn't even let him through the door. When Waid died, Houston didn't write a long tribute. He posted 3 words, "It is finished." Weeks later, doctors gave Houston his own diagnosis, and his response was almost a mirror image, defiant instead of grieving. Bring it on. That contrast, closing one chapter with surrender to fate and opening the next with total defiance, is why this story is spreading through the racing community right now. Let's break down why this moment carries so much weight beyond the obvious tragedy of the diagnosis itself. First, Houston isn't a casual figure in this sport. He spent over 3 decades documenting NASCAR from the inside, working up from a small local paper to becoming an editor at what was essentially the Bible of the Cup and Busch garages in the 1990s. When a person who has spent that long preserving other people's legacy suddenly becomes the story, it forces an entire community to confront its own mortality, not just his. Second, the timing with Waid's death changes the emotional math completely. In sports media, we talk a lot about institutional memory, the people who carry decades of context that a stat sheet can't capture. STAR just lost 1/2 of that in June. Now it risks losing the other half. That's not just a personal loss for Houston's family. That's a potential gap in how an entire era of stock car racing gets remembered, from Dale Earnhardt's Daytona obsession to Alan Kulwicki's improbable title run. Third, and this is the part we're sitting with, Houston's decision to keep producing the podcast is either the most inspiring or the most complicated part of this story, depending on how you look at it. On one hand, purpose and routine are proven to help people cope with serious illness. On the other, there's a real question about pacing, about how much a person going to aggressive treatment should be carrying publicly. Neither answer is wrong, but it's the kind of decision that fans and colleagues are going to be watching closely in the coming months. This isn't a locker room story. There's no trade, no suspension, no playoff implication in the traditional sense. But make no mistake, this is a story about legacy, about who controls the narrative of a sport, and about what happens when the people writing history become part of it. The reaction across the NASCAR community has been immediate and emotional. Longtime fans who grew up reading Houston's work are flooding the replies with memories of his books, particularly NASCAR's Greatest Race and Dale versus Daytona, 2 titles considered required reading for serious fans of the sport's history. Fellow journalists Ace, several of whom credit Waid and Houston's generation with mentoring them into the business, are publicly processing what it means to potentially lose 2 pillars of NASCAR media coverage in the same summer. And then there's the tone shift. This isn't outrage, this isn't controversy in the traditional sports sense. It's something rarer for this kind of content, a wave of genuine respect mixed with real worry, mixed with something close to hope because of how Houston chose to frame it. So where does this go from here? 2 scenarios. Best case, Houston responds to treatment, continues hosting the Scene Vault podcast as he's promised, and uses this next chapter to do what he's always done, turn a hard story into one worth telling. If that happens, this becomes one of the most talked about comeback narratives in racing media in years. Worst case, pancreatic cancer that has already spread is aggressive and the timeline for many patients in this stage is short. If that's the path this takes, NASCAR will be saying goodbye to 2 of the sport's most important historical voices within months of each other, a gut punch the community may not be fully prepared for. Either way, the next few months will define how this story is remembered. So here's the question. When someone who has spent their entire career telling other people's stories suddenly becomes the story themselves, what do we owe them? Do we give them space, or do we listen the way he's always asked us to listen to the sport's history? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're a longtime NASCAR fan, tell us which of Houston's books or stories meant the most to you. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, hit subscribe, because we're going to keep following this one and we're not going anywhere either.